Hello everyone, welcome to this series of videos on Dante's Commedia. This is the first, a general introduction to the poem. There will be 3 more focused introductions to each of the 3 books to follow. So if you do each in about 10 or 15 minutes, you'll have a good grasp on the entire poem in just a little over an hour. I begin by asking you to think about those times when maybe you've been daydreaming or zoned out and all of a sudden come to your senses. You've been driving on autopilot, for instance, in the car, and suddenly think, how did I get here? Or you've been sitting through a lecture, not one of my lectures, of course, but a lecture, and suddenly kind of come to and the class is doing something and you're not doing it. That's how this poem begins. Only the narrator comes to his senses in a darkened forest, and he can't find the trail that he took to get there. These are the opening lines. Midway through the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Such a magnificent, really uncanny moment of uncertainty and anxiety right here at the beginning of the poem. You have to imagine him asking, how did I get here? How am I going to get home? The Commedia is an answer to that question. How am I going to get home? The Divine Comedy, or the Commedia, that's the word in Dante's original Italian vernacular, is an epic 14th century poem about a living person who journeys to the 3 realms of the afterlife. The author's name is Dante Alighieri, who was a real man born in Florence in 1265. The fictional character who visits the afterlife in the poem and returns to write about it is also named Dante. And just be warned, he doesn't say that it's made up. He doesn't say this is a dream vision, which was popular in the Middle Ages. In fact, Dante insists repeatedly that he's telling the truth. Well, what is that truth? Readers have come looking for visions of the torments of hell and the rewards of paradise. And they find that, you'll find it too. But they also find a really gripping narrative, a story about a real person trying to find his way out of an enormously difficult time in his life. The real Dante, in fact, was on the brink of losing everything: his home, his family, everything he held dear. So the crux of the story is this person learning to lose a self and to be a new self, to reshape the world around him and understand it according to his own renewed imagination. The way Dante tells it, it will be a homecoming that will eventually lead him to his true self, to that self we find when we're able to cast off fear and error and habit that keep us trapped. That happy outcome is what gives the poem its name, Commedia, the comedy, which Dante says is simply a story that begins in sorrow and ends in joy, as opposed to a tragedy which begins in joy and ends in sorrow. So your edition may say Divine Comedy, that's pretty common. Divina was a word actually added later because the poem makes such compelling truth claims. Dante, in fact, calls it a sacred poem. I'll read those first lines again, this time in Italian, then in English. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. Midway through the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. So right away you spot the problem there, the problem of the self, right? Which was both lost and found. I came to myself, mi ritrovai. So the Italian is I re-found myself. There's what's at stake, a self lost and a self re-found. You'll also notice that it gets going incredibly quickly, right? Bang, we've begun like a thunderclap. Dante is a master storyteller, and part of enjoying the Commedia is learning to enjoy his storytelling techniques. Those include exposition, rising and falling action, blackouts, flashbacks, etc. It's a great yarn. Those first lines are also a signal that he learned to tell stories from the great poems of Greek and Roman antiquity, called epics. These were long poems narrating the deeds, typically they're of war or adventure, of historic figures in historic settings. The Iliad recounts the events leading up to the fall of Troy. The Odyssey follows Odysseus's sea voyages after that battle. Dante's favorite was Virgil's Aeneid, the story of a Trojan who in fact escapes from the events of the Iliad to found the city that would become Rome. Epic poems begin in medias res, That's Latin for in the middle of a thing. And Dante actually uses the words nel mezzo, so in the middle, to signal to us that he wants to write an epic poem. In other words, he's gunning for the big leagues. But keep in mind, this is not a poem about a war or a great city, but about a single guy on a few days in the 14th century. It's both incredibly specific historically. We can identify the dates on which the journey takes place, and it's exemplary. That is, it stands in for a larger journey that we all take. So again, these fictional events take place in the year 1300. Now, around that time in his life, Dante had become embroiled in political conflict. He had gained a position of great political power in Florence, but at the altogether wrong time, because a civil war was brewing. In November 1301, a foreign king, Charles of Valois, entered the city with the aid of a guy named Corso Donati, with over 1,000 knights, and in a violent coup, ousted the party in charge, Dante's party. That coup lasted for 2 weeks. There was fire, rioting in the streets, chaos in the city, and at that time, fortunately, Dante had been sent on a diplomatic trip to Rome, trying to negotiate a peace with Pope Boniface VIII, who was secretly supporting the coup back in Florence. Before Dante could get home, his enemies had taken over the city, charged him and hundreds of others with serious crimes, and exiled him under pain of death by burning at the stake. Fearing for his life after he learned of this sentence, Dante stayed away and he never returned to Florence. He died 20 years later in the city of Ravenna in northern Italy. So with that background in place, finding himself, ritrovarsi, finding a new home, becomes really poignant, doesn't it? Because the home he has lost is both metaphorical and literal. He doesn't know who he is anymore. That's figural. He actually cannot return to the city of his birth. That's painfully literal, especially in the Middle Ages. So the darkness of the dark forest results from his politics, something of the constant political infighting and backbiting. We'll see that it's also a darkness that involves desperate self-doubt and maybe even thoughts of suicide. Scholars also call it a dark wood of sin and error. And indeed, the journey is undertaken, at least in part, because he's so full of sin and error that he can't see his way out. We don't know exactly what he did or why he was so distraught. It's hard to think, though, that it wasn't in some way related to all of this political upheaval. Dante says he can't find the straight way, la diritta via. And notice he says it was lost, using the passive voice. The straight way was lost. People use the passive voice grammatically to avoid taking responsibility. So politicians, instead of saying, I made the mistake, I lost the straight way, no, they say something like, the mistake was made, a wrong was done, I don't know, a war was started, or the straight way was lost. The passive voice is a way of kind of grammatically not taking responsibility for something. So the poem begins by admitting, I was in trouble, I couldn't find my way home, but it also begins by revealing, without saying, that he can't own what happened, that he can't take responsibility for it. Now, in the Christian Middle Ages, that home towards which we all move was also God, right? St. Augustine wrote, you have made us for yourself, O Lord. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So to go in search of that new rest, Dante is guided through 3 realms of the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and paradise. And although there are some risky moments along the way, he does, spoiler alert, make it to God. And by the way, in the fictional world, he returns to write the poem that we're reading. So the guy telling us about the journey in the fiction of the poem has already gone on it. He knows how it ends. We call that guy Dante the poet, the guy who has gone on the journey and is writing to us about it. The guy who is going on the journey and who is full of fear and insecurity and foibles, and we see him in the poem, we call him Dante the pilgrim, so that we can distinguish between the two. It's important because sometimes the pilgrim gets things wrong, and we're meant to see that so that we too can get them wrong and learn from him. The journey itself takes place on Easter weekend, 1300. That is the period from Good Friday, when the Christian narratives tell us that Christ was crucified, through the following day, when medieval Christians believed that Christ descended into hell, and to and beyond Easter Sunday, when he rose from the dead. So Dante's journey overlaps with the ancient epic pattern of homecoming, or nostos, as in the Odyssey. It overlaps with the autobiographical coming home to oneself. And it also overlaps with the Christian narrative of death and resurrection. In its essence, a coming home to God. Keep in mind that Dante, in this entire schema, is the Christ figure who will be resurrected from his exile, just as many theologians said, we are living in exile now as part of our lives, and in the afterlife we'll join God in our great homecoming. Now, all of the models of the Commedia point homeward. And this is particularly moving and heartbreaking when you remember that one simple fact. Dante wrote the poem when he had no home, when he was in exile, relying on patronage and the generosity of strangers and friends and foreigners to keep him alive, to feed him, to give him a room, to allow him to have a livelihood. Strangely enough, the first person whom he meets in that dark wood is a dead non-Christian, the Roman poet Virgil. And it's Virgil, not an angel, not a saint, or a monk, who will take him under his wing. What does it mean for a Christian poem to embrace a pagan poet in this way in the Middle Ages? To include, as it does, pre-Christian figures, both real and fictional, throughout the poem. For one thing, it means that Dante is aiming at something new, an all-encompassing and all-embracing worldview that looks to Greek and Roman antiquity, to biblical history, and to his contemporaries in the 13th century for models and exemplars. It means that here in the early 1300s, still firmly in what we would consider the late Middle Ages, Dante is beginning to set in motion the great period of revival and rediscovery that becomes known to later readers as the Renaissance, the rebirth. There's one thing I haven't mentioned before we wrap up, one person I haven't mentioned, and I'm holding off deliberately on her because there's so much to be said, but Virgil is actually acting as a guide on the instructions of a young woman whom Dante loved in real life, but who died 10 years before the poem takes place. Her name is Beatrice, or Beatrice, which means blessed. The entire journey is also a return to her, and we'll learn much more about her in the coming weeks. There's so much more to say, so much more, but the only way to get us going is to jump right in. It's time for us to go to hell. I'll see you there.